Hi everybody, thank you so much Mrs Davis and all the pupils at Ysgol Llywelyn for all those questions to the First Minister. I do have to give an apology to Cerys. Cerys, I'm so sorry, you asked a brilliant question on the lack of Welsh secondary schools in Powys, and we had to miss this off this time, mainly because the First Minister forgot to give the answer in English, and my Welsh is not as good as your English and I didn't know what he was saying. I have sent the entire interview to Mrs Davis now, so I hope you'll be able to see that and share that with friends and family at some point. So Cerys, I'm really sorry. Hello everybody, it's lovely to be here. I'm Rebecca Harvey, I'm editor of Co-op News. Co-op News is a magazine about and for cooperatives around the world. And actually Co-op News is celebrating its own anniversary this year, a mere 150 years to Robert Owen's 250, but it is humbling to think how much work Owen put into developing thinking and activity around ideas that would coalesce into cooperation for a whole century before our first edition. Robert Owen was many things. You know, he was an avid reader, he was a religious skeptic and a canny businessman to boot. But importantly for cooperation, he was a believer in the very, very human responsibility for moral and physical condition of other people. And as we know, his views on worker conditions, education, economics were one of the foundations for cooperative thinking. One part of that video that we've just seen really struck with me, and it was when the First Minister talks about how the co-op model that has roots in Newtown in Wales has travelled around the world. And we've heard from Nakira Kuramoto, and we're going to hear from Sara Vicari later as well, and how that model now informs the way jobs are created in the likes of not just in John Lewis and in Welsh Water, but the other 7,000 co-ops in the UK and the 3 million co-ops around the world. And as First Minister Mark Drakeford said in another interview recently, Robert Owen has contemporary relevance as well as historical legacy. And that's the whole theme of this whole webinar, isn't it? And also of this session, which is now going to talk about what Owenite ideals are still relevant to the modern cooperative movement. We're now going to hear from 3 very knowledgeable people about some of his different ideas and how they are relevant today. We're going to hear from Cilla Ross, who's principal at the Cooperative College in the UK, Gillian, Lonergan, who's historian, a librarian and an archivist, formerly of the Cooperative Heritage Trust, and also from Sara Vicari, who's a researcher and filmmaker based in Italy and who is associated with Aroundtheworld.coop, which is a brilliant collection of films that Sara and colleagues have made from co-ops around the world. So Cilla, let's speak with you first. As an educator yourself, Owen was a pioneer of education. So what ideals of Owen the educator are still relevant to co-ops today, do you think?
Thanks, Rebecca, and hello everyone. Well, I'm an absolute Owen nut. I think Owen was an incredibly important educator, not just within the co-op movement, but as Mark said, as a radical educator. And the ideals that were particularly important to Owen that are relevant today, I think there are 3 I'll just talk to briefly. One, of course, was that education was absolutely central to the growth and progress of the movement. It was central to everything that went on in terms of building a great co-op, of behaving cooperatively, of building a co-op movement. But it was an incredible project because it wasn't just about making a little cooperative movement. It was about trying to change the world. It was that big. It was nothing short than the total transformation of humanity. Now, that central role of education that Owen saw then, in our view, in my view, and I would say that coming from the college perspective, is as critical now. And all of our forward-thinking sections of the co-op movement globally also acknowledge that. So it's absolutely central. The second is actually the role of values. And what Owen was doing, he was coming at it a different way. He was trying to find what made a good person in the 1830s. And he concluded it was education. But he had a very strong values-based approach, which centered in on developing a system that was opposite to capitalism, because he thought competition brought out the worst things in people. So in New Lanark and in all of his work, he used education to build a different type of person. And a lot of the values we see in our current schooling and so on, and in our the good work we do with people, is actually bringing out those best things. And then finally, another great idea of Owen's was actually lifelong education, because Owen was obviously, I think it was the first nursery school in the world was started by Owen, but also he's a passionate believer in adult education, in night classes, but not just who did the learning, but the type of learning you did. So it was informal learning, it was learning in the workplace, it was learning in the home. And of course, they are ideas that totally resonate now with cooperators and others. So all of those big three themes are absolutely critical to the contemporary movement as we learn to engage with the big challenges of our time.
Thanks, Cilla. And I guess building on that, what do you think Owen would make of the state of education today, not just in the UK, but around the world, and the different types of learning that we can see?
Well, I think he'd be very pleased with the way that we're doing learning. We're much more learner-centred. We do take an intergenerational approach. We have embraced lifelong learning, but I think he'd also be disappointed that a lot of learning is not around the whole person. And those young people, when we were talking before about, you know, it was totally what we would call interdisciplinary. You could do music, you could do art, you can do history, you can do politics. And what we've increasingly I think seen as quite a narrow focus on learning, which is very much around skills for employability, which are very important, but perhaps miss off some of the other things. And he'd be very disappointed to see a lot of the budget cuts that we've seen actually around some of the arts and humanities. But he would also, I think, really welcome the way we think about where we learn, because now, of course, it's not just learning in the formal classroom, it's using technology to do it differently, it's learning in different types of learning spaces. So I think he'd be very interested in what in how we learn, but perhaps there would be a slight concern that education is not always seen as quite as central as he would have seen it. Training is seen as central, but perhaps less so that much wider, civil society, human. He wanted to see humane people, Owen. He talked about that. So a full-rounded person. So I think we need to keep an eye on that in terms of the type of co-op education we do.
Cilla, thank you so much. That you're exactly right about. I was thinking of Robert Owen when all the cuts around the art subjects came up in the university and higher education recently. It's such a shame at the moment. But as well as being an educator, Robert Owen was a businessman. So Gillian Lonergan, are you there?
I am here.
Hurrah! So Gillian, let's talk about Owen the businessman then, because he was a businessman, he was an activist, and he wasn't always popular. Do you think his approach to activism in particular and his approach and the way he went about that is relevant today? And what can we learn about his approach to activism?
I had the privilege, and it really was a privilege, of spending my working life in the National Cooperative Archive, where there are 3,000 letters of Robert Owen, plus a huge range of publications and stuff. And I can honestly say the more that I found out about Robert Owen, the more I think he was an amazing man. And a lot of the things that he did were so amazing. Now, one of the things that I think we can learn from Robert Owen is never, ever give up. Whatever happens, whatever criticism you get, you need to carry on. If you know what's wrong and you know what needs to be done to remedy something that's going wrong, just get out there and do it. And it's that be active. Don't just sit around complaining about it, but get out there and do it. That's the real thing that is key, I think, to Robert Owen. I mean, it was such a time of change, the Industrial Revolution and everything else. He'd lived in London, he'd lived in Manchester, he had seen where things were going wrong, people being exploited, horrendous living and working conditions. So all of that stuff came together. He could see the way things needed to change. I don't think he was always as patient as he could have been with people who didn't see it the same way as him. And I don't think for a minute that he was an easy person to get along with all the time. But what he did was amazing. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about him not being popular, one of the things that he was doing, which the First Minister mentioned earlier, was getting children out of working in the mills and in the mines. It was normal to start work at the age of 6. But he had huge criticism for that, both from the mill owners and factory owners, because they were losing cheap labour, basically. But he also got criticised by the working class families of those children, because it was an environment where children went out to work at the age of 6, and that the income that they brought in helped to keep the family. So it was a great thing to do, but it was actually reducing their family income. So he was getting all sorts of criticism for all sides. Did it stop him? No, it jolly well didn't. He just carried on until he got the law changed.
So what would he be carrying on about today? What laws would he try to be changing, and what would he be campaigning on in 2021?
I'm really sorry to have to say this, but a lot of the things that he was campaigning about 200 years ago, he would still be campaigning about today. I mean, again, the First Minister mentioned the sort of precarious working conditions that an awful lot of people have. Owen would have hated that. You know, he wanted people to be respected at work, to be taken account of. When you're running a business, you need to talk to the workforce, you need to involve the workforce. And that, to a great extent, isn't done today either. You know, a lot of us have experienced working lives that are great and no problems at all, but we can see huge numbers of other people who have problems. Another thing that he was involved in was trying to improve housing conditions. We still have a huge amount of really substandard housing in this country, which I'm ashamed of, and I know that Owen would have been ashamed of it too. And also education. I mean, we have a really good education system in this country, but we still have inequalities. I mean, the pandemic has shown that up, where some children didn't succeed in doing the schoolwork that was put out online because they didn't have access to technology. That is not equal educational opportunity. And that, I think, is something that he would be quite keen to remedy as well. And
by the sounds of it, he could get things done as well. He could make those changes, which would be excellent to see. In another interview we did recently with Mr. Drakeford, he said Owen was one of those relatively rare people who could bridge the world of ideas and the world of practical delivery, because it wasn't just that he had ideas, he went out and tried to make them happen and show how they could make a difference in actual people's actual lives. So no, it's good to hear that from yourself as well, Gillian. Thank you very much. One person that has been documenting different people's lives and the effects of cooperation on that is Sara Vicari. Hello, Sara. So, hello. Robert Owen didn't quite get all around the world, but he did spend years in America and elsewhere, and the mills he co-owned at New Lanark were visited by people in their thousands, including from mainland Europe. So which of Robert Owen's international ideals do you think are still relevant to the modern cooperative movement?
Thank you, Becca. Thank you very much for the question. And I would like to share that, I mean, while reading again some of the Owen's writings, I had a feeling, you know, I imagined myself to interview Owens as one of the cooperators that I met during our Around the World trip. And that was fascinating and so inspiring. And perhaps one of his international ideas still relevant. I really loved reading him talking about the human race. So everywhere is actually having this mind of a global community where everyone should put in action for the benefit of humanity as a whole. So I think that this still is the essence, the very essence of the cooperative movement today, is when to unlock the human potential and act for social change, meaning pulling people out of poverty, pulling people out of slavery conditions everywhere. So in different contexts, as for instance, we met the gig gig economy workers in New York, or women who passed by landowners in Nepal or Brazil. So I would say that this tension for the benefit of the human beings as a whole, that is still absolutely relevant. And I would also stress the spiritual dimension of Owen. I remember in the last General Assembly of the International Co-operative Alliance, Vandana Shiva talking about that collective emotional intelligence of cooperators. I would say this strong inner power of cooperators, and they act not just for the mere production and distribution, but really to contributing to a bigger ideal, vision of the world, of the global community. Of course, this goes hand in hand with education activism, as Cilla and Gillian was perfectly saying. And in this sense, I think that it's still very relevant for the international movement to learn from each other, to share and innovate, learning from each other. And I think this is another important pillar that is still relevant today.
I love the idea of this global community, collective emotional intelligence of cooperative. That's a brilliant way of putting it. So talking about the global cooperative movement, Sara, what do you think Owen would make of the state of the global cooperative movement today in 2021?
This is a very interesting, tricky question. So for sure, from one end, I would say it would be impressed. I mean, if we look at the capacity of community around the world, communities to innovate, readapt to shocks, changes. I mean, the last is the pandemic, reinvent themselves, while, as we said, pulling people out of poverty and slavery conditions. But at the same time, I totally agree with, Cilla and Gillian that were speaking before. Would be upset exactly because cooperatives are still working for that. So the existence of slavery, the existence of inequality, probably also its vision to see the capitalistic system probably be overcome and see that we are still struggling into this system. And maybe, perhaps it would also recommend us to be a bit braver, more to offer ourselves as the alternative. So perhaps I might say that it wouldn't be so happy sometimes to see some cooperators complaining because of the democratic system internal of the cooperatives, or someone talking about cooperatives as a capitalism conscious. Maybe there are some. So I guess that probably wouldn't be so in line with these kind of approaches. But for sure, I would recommend, I guess. Also, I mean, it was so interesting about surroundings. And probably is what we call today as the enabling environment. So really pushing, advocating, and lobbying for all those policies that could, and programs that could support people to have that kind of social opportunity, economic opportunity, education, healthcare, that really allow people to make the most of their freedoms and have a meaningful life. And this pandemic is absolutely relevant more than ever.
Inspiring words, Sara. Thank you so much. I think the message of needing to be braver and holding ourselves as the alternative, but also holding each other to account is a really important message there. So Sara, thank you very much. Friends, Gillian, Cilla, Sara, thank you again for a fascinating conversation. There's going to be so much to think about, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation shortly. I think now we have time for about a 5-minute comfort break, and I think there's going to be a 3D tour for those remaining. So take your 5 minutes, and then we'll return at about 5:02.